Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison speaking. The voice crackled through the intercom with barely controlled panic. We have an emergency situation. I need to know immediately. Is there a military fighter pilot on board this aircraft? If so, please identify yourself to the flight. Attendance right now. The cabin of Flight 447 from Los Angeles to New York erupted into confused murmurs. Passengers exchanged worried glances. Parents pulled their children closer, and the businessman in 12C started frantically typing what looked like a goodbye message to his family. In seat 23F, near the back of the plane, Jade Williams stirred from the light sleep she'd finally managed to fall into after the turbulent first hour of the flight. At 34 years old, she'd learned to sleep anywhere, a skill developed over a decade of military service where rest came in whatever brief moments you could steal between missions. The announcement repeated, more urgent this time. I repeat, we need a fighter pilot. This is not a drill. If you have military flight experience, particularly with high-performance aircraft, we need you in the cockpit immediately. Jade sat up slowly, her mind already processing the situation with the tactical clarity that had kept her alive through 2 combat deployments and over 200 flight hours in an F-16 Fighting Falcon. Whatever was happening up front, it was serious enough that a commercial airline captain was breaking every protocol in the Yin book. She pressed the call button. The flight attendant who appeared at her row was the same one who'd barely made eye contact when serving drinks earlier, the one who'd automatically handed the extra peanuts to the white man in the suit sitting across the aisle, assuming he was the one who'd asked, even though it had been Jade's request. Yes? The attendant asked, her tone suggesting she expected a request for a blanket or another ginger ale. I'm a fighter pilot, Jade said calmly. 10 years, United States Air Force, F-16s. Tell the captain I'm coming forward. The flight attendant's eyes widened, then narrowed with obvious skepticism. She glanced at Jade's casual travel clothes, jeans, a Howard University sweatshirt, her natural hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Ma'am, this is a serious emergency. We don't have time for— I know it's serious, Jade interrupted, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd commanded respect in situations far more dangerous than a skeptical flight attendant. That's why you need to stop wasting time and take me to the cockpit. Now. My name is Jade Williams, and I'd spent the last decade proving I belonged in spaces where people assumed I didn't. First at the Air Force Academy, where my freshman year roommate had asked if I was there on an affirmative action thing. Then in flight school, where an instructor had suggested I might be more comfortable in transport aircraft instead of fighters. And finally, in my squadron, where I'd had to be twice as good to get half the recognition of my male counterparts. I'd left active duty 6 months ago, burned out from fighting battles on the ground that were somehow harder than the ones in the air. Now I was flying commercial to New York for a job interview with a corporate aviation company, a position that would pay well and let me fly without the constant weight of proving myself. But old habits die hard, and when a captain calls for help, you answer. The flight attendant, her name tag read Christine, was still hesitating when the intercom crackled again. We have approximately 12 minutes before we lose hydraulic pressure completely. If there's anyone with fighter jet experience, we need you now. 12 minutes, Jade repeated, standing up. That's how long you have to decide if your prejudice is worth more than the lives of everyone on this plane. I'm going to the cockpit. You can either escort me or get out of my way. Something in Jade's tone must have finally registered, because Christine's professional mask cracked slightly. Follow me, she said, turning toward the front of the plane. As they moved through the cabin, Jade could feel the stares. A black woman in a college sweatshirt, claiming to be a fighter pilot, heading to the cockpit during an emergency. She could practically hear the doubts, the assumptions, the same skepticism she'd faced her entire career. The man in the expensive suit in 12C actually grabbed Christine's arm as they passed. Are you seriously taking her to the cockpit? Shouldn't you be looking for someone more qualified? Jade didn't break stride. Sir, I've landed an F-16 with one engine on fire and hydraulics failing at 400 knots. I think I can handle whatever's happening up there. Now let go of her arm before I make you." Christine pulled free and continued forward, but Jade caught the slight smile on her face. Maybe she was starting to believe. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Morrison turned around. He was in his late 50s, grey hair, the kind of weathered face that came from decades in the air. His co-pilot, a younger man who looked barely 30, was frantically working through a checklist, sweat visible on his forehead. "You're the fighter pilot?" Morrison asked, his tone carrying the same doubt Jade had heard 1,000 times before. "Major Jade Williams, United States Air Force, retired 6 months ago, F-16 fighting Falcon, over 200 combat hours, including emergency landings, hydraulic failures, and one incident where I had to land with partial flight control after taking ground fire over Afghanistan." She rattled off her credentials with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to establish credibility quickly. "What's your situation?" Morrison's skepticism wavered as he processed her words, but there wasn't time for a full interrogation. "Hydraulic failure in the primary and backup systems. We're losing pressure fast, which means we're about to lose most of our flight controls. The plane will become nearly impossible to maneuver using conventional methods." Jade's mind immediately went to the emergency procedures she'd drilled thousands of times. "You'll need to use differential thrust, varying the power to each engine, to control. Direction. It's how I landed my F-16 when I lost hydraulics over Kandahar. I've never done that in a commercial aircraft," Morrison admitted, and for the first time, Jade heard genuine fear in his voice. "I've trained for hydraulic failures, but not complete loss. Not in a 737 with 180 passengers, but I have," Jade said quietly. "Different aircraft, same physics. If you let me talk you through it, we might be able to get this plane on the ground in one piece." The co-pilot, whose name tag read Stevens, looked up from his checklist. "Captain, we're down to 8 minutes of hydraulic pressure. After that, we won't be able to control the ailerons, rudder, or elevators through normal means." Morrison looked at Jade, really looked at her for the first time. She could see him weighing his options. Trust the black woman in the college sweatshirt who claimed to be a fighter, pilot, or try to handle this himself with no experience in the technique she was describing. "What's your plan?" he asked finally. "First, we need to understand exactly what controls we're about to lose and start compensating with engine thrust before the hydraulics fail completely. Second, we need to find the nearest suitable airport, preferably with a long runway and emergency services standing by. Third, we need to prepare the passengers for a rough landing without causing a panic." Jade moved closer to the instrument panel, her eyes scanning the gauges with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years reading similar displays at supersonic speeds. "You're at 35,000 feet, speed 480 knots. When the hydraulics go, you'll need to reduce speed significantly. Differential thrust steering is much more effective at lower speeds." "How much lower?" Stevens asked. "Around 250 knots. For approach, slower for landing, but we'll need to descend gradually and maintain precise power management on all engines. One mistake and we could enter an uncontrolled roll." Morrison's jaw tightened. "You're talking about flying a commercial airliner like it's a fighter jet. I'm talking using fighter jet emergency procedures to save a commercial airliner," Jade corrected. "It's not ideal, but it's better than the alternative." The captain looked at his co-pilot, then back at Jade. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the same calculation she'd seen in the eyes of every person who'd ever doubted her. The difference was, this time, lives depended on him making the right choice. "All right, Major Williams," he said finally, gesturing to the jump seat behind the co-pilot's position. "Talk us through it. But if this goes wrong, we all have the same problem," Jade interrupted, settling into the jump seat. "So let's make sure it doesn't go wrong." As she strapped in, Jade felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with high-stakes flying. This wasn't how she'd planned to spend her cross-country flight. She was supposed to be sleeping, preparing for her interview, thinking about a future that didn't involve proving herself in life-or-death situations. But here she was, back in the fight, with 180 lives depending on skills she'd earned through years of being underestimated and overlooked. The hydraulic pressure gauge continued its steady decline, 6 minutes until complete failure. "Captain, start reducing throttle on engines 1 and 2, Jade instructed, her voice calm and clear. "We need to begin our descent and get a feel for how the aircraft responds before we lose conventional controls entirely." Morrison's hands moved, to the throttles, and Jade felt the plane begin to respond. Through the cockpit windows, she could see the ground far below, getting slowly closer. Somewhere in the cabin behind them, 180 passengers were probably praying, crying, or writing goodbye messages to their loved ones. They had no idea that their best chance of survival was the black woman in the college sweatshirt who'd been sleeping in seat 23F. The woman that flight attendant had almost dismissed, that the man in 12C had questioned, that Captain Morrison had doubted. But they were about to find out what Jade Williams had spent a decade proving to everyone who'd ever underestimated her, that skill, courage, and competence don't care about your expectations or prejudices. The hydraulic gauge hit the red zone. 4 minutes until complete failure. "All right, gentlemen," Jade said, leaning forward to get a better view of the instruments. "Let's show them how it's done. If you've ever been underestimated because of how you look, you know that moment when you get to prove everyone wrong is both terrifying and exhilarating. And if you want to see how a woman who spent her career being doubted saves an entire plane full of people who never saw her coming, you'll want to follow this story to the end." The hydraulic pressure gauge dropped into the critical zone, and Jade watched as Captain Morrison's knuckles went white on the controls. She'd seen that grip before, on her own hands, the first time she'd had to land a crippled aircraft with nothing but engine power and prayer. "Hydraulics are at 15%, Stevens announced, his voice climbing an octave. "We're losing it faster than the manual says we should." "Manuals are written for ideal conditions," Jade said calmly. "This isn't ideal, Captain. I need you to trust the engines now. Forget everything you know about using the yoke for turns. Add power to the left engines, reduce on the right. Small adjustments." Morrison hesitated, his hands still gripping the conventional controls like a lifeline. Jade recognized that hesitation. It was the same pause she'd seen in her flight instructor's face at the academy when he'd suggested she reconsider her fighter track application. The pause that said, "Can I really trust this person with something this important?" "Captain," Jade's voice sharpened, "we don't have time for doubt. Either you trust in me, or you're flying this plane into the ground with 180 people on board. Your choice, but make it now." The intercom crackled. It was Christine's voice, strained and professional. "Captain, we have a situation in the cabin. Some passengers are demanding to know who's helping in the cockpit. They're concerned about the qualifications." Of course they were. Jade felt the familiar burn of frustration in her chest, the same feeling she'd carried through every briefing where her male colleagues' opinions were accepted without question, while hers required 3 sources and a PowerPoint presentation. "Tell them," Morrison said, his eyes still on the instruments, "that Major Williams has more emergency landing experience than anyone else on this aircraft, including me." It was a small thing, that validation, but Jade felt something shift in the cockpit. Morrison was starting to believe. "Hydraulics at 10%, Stevens called out. "Captain, we need to declare an emergency and get clearance for the nearest airport." "Already on it," Morrison said, switching to the emergency frequency. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. United Flight 447, complete hydraulic failure, requesting immediate clearance to nearest suitable airport." The response came back instantly. "Flight 447, this is Denver Center. We copy your mayday. Denver International is 47 miles northeast of your position. Runway 16R is clear. Emergency services are being notified. Descend and maintain 15,000 feet." Denver, Jade said, running calculations in her head. Long runways, good emergency response. That's our best option. But as Morrison began the turn toward Denver, the plane lurched violently to the left. Without hydraulics, the aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control, responding to inputs with a sluggish unpredictability that made Jade's pulse quicken. Too much power differential, she said quickly. Ease back on engine 1, add a touch to engine 4. Think of it like balancing on a knife edge. Every input has to be precise and gradual. Morrison made the adjustment and the plane steadied slightly, but Jade could see the sweat on his forehead, the tension in his shoulders. He was a skilled pilot, but this was outside his experience. This was her world, the world of flying broken aircraft through sheer will and technical precision. A memory flashed through her mind. Afghanistan, 2019. She'd been on a close air support mission when ground fire had shredded her hydraulic lines. The stick had gone dead in her hands, and for one terrifying moment, she'd thought that was it. Her last flight, her last breath, another name on the memorial wall. But her instructor's voice had echoed in her head. Williams, you fly with your brain first, your hands second. If the plane won't respond to the stick, make it respond to something else. She'd used differential thrust to limp back to base, landing on a runway lined with fire trucks and ambulances. The debrief had lasted 6 hours. The medal ceremony had lasted 20 minutes, and the whispers in the squadron had lasted months. Lucky she didn't kill herself. Probably froze up and the plane just happened to land itself. They'd never said that about the male pilots who'd had similar emergencies. Their landings were skilled and heroic. Hers was lucky. Major Williams? Stevens's voice pulled her back to the present. The hydraulics just hit 5%. We're about to lose everything. Jade leaned forward, her eyes scanning the engine instruments. All right, this is where it gets interesting. When the hydraulics fail completely, the plane is going to want to do its own thing. Captain, you're going to feel like you've lost all control, because conventionally you have. But the engines are still responding, and that's all we need. All we need. Morrison's voice carried an edge of panic. Major, I've been flying for 30 years, and I've been flying broken aircraft for 10. Jade interrupted. This is what I do. This is what I'm good at. So please let me do my job. The hydraulic gauge hit 0. The yoke went slack in Morrison's hands, and Jade watched his face go pale. It was one thing to talk about losing flight controls. It was another to feel the aircraft become a 150,000-pound glider with engines. Stay calm, Jade said, her voice cutting through the rising panic. Stevens, call out our altitude and speed. Captain, hands off the yoke. It's useless now. Focus only on the throttles. We're going to fly this plane like a fighter jet with no stick. Pure engine management. The plane began to drift right, and Jade immediately called out corrections. Add power to engines 3 and 4. Reduce 1 and 2. Small movements, Captain. Think of it like steering a boat. You're using the current, not fighting it. Morrison's hands moved to the throttles, and slowly, painfully, the plane began to respond. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't pretty, but they were maintaining something resembling controlled flight. Altitude 28,000 feet. Descending at 1,500 feet per minute, Stevens reported. Speed 420 knots. Too fast, Jade said. We need to slow down before we get anywhere near landing configuration. Reduce power across all engines, but maintain the differential for directional control. As Morrison made the adjustments, the cockpit door opened slightly, and Christine appeared, her face tight with stress. Captain, I need to inform you, there's a passenger in first class who's demanding to speak with you. He says he's a pilot, and he wants to know why you're taking instructions from her. The way Christine said her made it clear what the passenger had actually said. Jade didn't need to guess. She'd heard every variation of the doubt, the dismissal, the assumption that she couldn't possibly know what she was doing. Tell him, Morrison said, not taking his eyes off the throttles, that Major Williams is currently the only reason we're not in an uncontrolled descent. And if he has a problem with that, he can file a complaint after we land. If we land. Christine nodded and disappeared, but the damage was done. Jade could feel the weight of that doubt, that questioning, even as she was literally saving lives. It was the story of her career, compressed into one impossible flight. Another memory, her first day at the academy. The upperclassman who'd looked at her and said, "You know the washout rate for women in the fighter track is over 60%, right? Maybe you should consider something more suitable." She'd smiled and said, "Then I guess I'll be in the 40%. She'd graduated third in her class. The upperclassman had washed out sophomore year. "Altitude 22,000 feet, Stevens called. "Denver is 35 miles out. They're asking for our approach plan. Tell them we'll need the longest runway they have, and we'll be coming in hot," Jade said. "Without hydraulics, we can't deploy flaps or slats, which means we can't slow down as much as normal. We're looking at a landing speed of around 200 knots instead of the usual 140. That's almost 100 knots over normal landing." "Speed," Morrison said, his voice strained. "The runway is 16,000 feet long," Jade finished. "I checked while you were talking to Denver Center. It's enough if we do this right, but it's going to be rough, and we're going to need every inch of that runway." The plane shuddered as they descended, through some turbulence, and Morrison's hands jerked on the throttles, overcorrecting. The aircraft rolled sharply left, and for a moment Jade thought they might enter a spin. "Steady," she commanded. "Don't overcorrect. Let the plane settle, then make small adjustments. You're doing fine, Captain, but you need to trust the process." Morrison took a breath and eased the throttles back to center, and the plane slowly leveled out. But Jade could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that he was flying an aircraft using a technique he'd never trained for, guided by a woman he'd doubted minutes ago. "Major Williams," he said quietly, "if we don't make it, we're going to make it," Jade interrupted. "I didn't survive 2 combat deployments and a decade of being told I didn't belong, just to die on a commercial flight to a job interview. We're landing this plane, Captain. All of us. Together." Stevens looked back at her, and for the first time she saw something other than doubt in his eyes. It might have been respect, or maybe just desperate hope, but it was better than skepticism. "Altitude 18,000 feet, he reported. "Denver in sight, 25 miles. Through the cockpit window, Jade could see the city sprawling below them, the airport visible in the distance, so close, but still so far. They had to maintain control through the descent, line up with the runway without the ability to make fine adjustments, and then somehow land a plane traveling 60 knots faster than it was, designed to touch down. It was impossible. It was insane. It was exactly the kind of challenge that Jade had spent her entire career preparing for. "All right, gentlemen," she said, leaning forward. "This is where we earn our wings. Captain, start reducing power gradually across all engines. We need to slow down, but we can't afford to lose altitude control. Stevens, I need you on the radio with Denver. Tell them we're going to need foam on the runway and every emergency vehicle they have standing by." As Stevens made the call, Jade's mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating angles, speeds, and the 1,000 tiny variables that would determine whether they walked away from this or became another statistic. Behind them, in the cabin, 180 people were trusting their lives to a crew they couldn't see, making decisions they couldn't understand. And at the center of it all was a black woman in a college sweatshirt who'd been sleeping in seat 23F, invisible, overlooked, underestimated, until the moment she became the only thing standing between them and disaster. The question wasn't whether Jade could land this plane. The question was whether the people in the cockpit and the passengers in the cabin could finally see past their assumptions long enough to let her try. "Flight 447 Denver Tower. Be advised winds are picking up. Currently 280 at 25, gusting to 35 knots. Crosswind component on runway 16R is approximately 20 knots. Do you want to consider runway 25? Jade's jaw tightened. A 20-knot crosswind on a plane with no hydraulics was like trying to thread a needle while riding a motorcycle. But switching runways meant a longer approach, more time for something else to go wrong, and a shorter runway. Negative, she said before Morrison could respond. We stay. With 16R. It's longer and we're going to need every foot. Captain, tell them we're committed to 16R. Morrison hesitated, his finger hovering over the radio button. Major, a 20-knot crosswind without hydraulics is manageable if we adjust our approach angle and use asymmetric thrust to incompensate, Jade finished. I've landed in worse, trust me. There was that word again, trust. The thing Jade had spent her entire career trying to earn, only to have it questioned at every turn. Morrison keyed the radio. Denver Tower, Flight 447. We're committed to runway 16R, requesting priority. Handling and emergency equipment in position. Roger, 447. You're cleared for straight-in approach, runway 16R. Emergency equipment is standing by. Altitude? 15,000 feet descending, Stevens reported, then turned to look at Jade. Major, at what point do we commit to the landing? If something goes wrong on approach. There's no go-round option, Jade said bluntly. Without hydraulics, we can't add flaps, we can't increase lift efficiently, and we don't have the control authority to safely climb and circle. Once we start this approach, we're landing, one way or another. The weight of those words settled over the cockpit like a heavy blanket, one way or another. Either they walked away from this, or they didn't. Stevens swallowed hard, and Jade saw his hands trembling slightly on the checklist. He was young, probably hadn't seen much beyond routine flights and the occasional weather diversion. This was beyond his training, beyond his experience, beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd put on his uniform that morning. Hey, Jade said, her voice softer. Stevens, look at me. He turned, his eyes wide with barely controlled fear. You're doing great, she continued. Your call-outs are precise, your radio work is professional, and you're keeping your head when a lot of people would be falling apart. We're going to get through this, but I need you focused. Can you do that? Stevens took a breath and nodded. Yes, ma'am. Good, because in about 10 minutes, we're going to do something that's going to end up in the training manuals, and I want you to remember every second of it. A ghost of a smile crossed Stevens's face, and Jade saw some of the tension leave his shoulders. Sometimes people just needed to be reminded they were capable of more than they thought. The cockpit door opened again, and this time Christine entered fully, closing it behind her. Her professional composure was cracking at the edges. Major Williams, I need to be honest with you. There are passengers in the cabin they're scared, and some of them are saying things about you, about whether you're really qualified. Let me guess, Jade said, not taking her eyes off the instruments. They want to know why a black woman is in the cockpit instead of someone who looks like a pilot. Christine's silence was answer enough. Jade had heard it all. Before, at the academy. Are you sure you're in the right place? In flight school, maybe you'd be better suited for transport. In her squadron, it's just that fighter pilots usually have a certain profile. The profile they meant was male, white, and preferably from a military family. Jade was none of those things. Her father had been a mechanic, her mother a teacher. She'd grown up in Baltimore, not on a military base, and she'd had to fight for every opportunity, every flight hour, every ounce of respect. Christine, Jade said calmly, go back to the cabin and tell those passengers that Major Jade Williams has over 200 combat flight hours, has landed damaged aircraft in hostile territory, and is currently the only person on this plane who knows how to land without hydraulics. Tell them that their opinions about my qualifications are irrelevant, and if they'd like to file a complaint, they're welcome to do so after we're safely on the ground, which we will be, because I'm very good at my job. Christine nodded slowly. And if they still don't believe, then they can close their eyes and pray, Jade interrupted. Because belief is optional, results aren't. Now go make sure everyone is in their seats with their seatbelts tight. This landing is going to be rough. As Christine left, Morrison glanced back at Jade. You've dealt with this your whole career, haven't you? The doubt, the questions. Every single day, Jade confirmed. You get used to it, or you don't. And you quit. I didn't quit. Altitude 12,000 feet, Stevens called out. Denver is 15 miles. We're high on the approach path. Reduce power on all engines, Jade instructed. We need to lose altitude without gaining speed. Captain, this is going to feel wrong. Every instinct is going to tell you. We're descending too fast. Ignore those instincts. Trust the numbers. Morrison pulled back on the throttles, and the plane's descent rate increased. Jade watched the altimeter spin downward, calculating the approach angle in her head. They were coming in steep, but that was necessary to lose the excess altitude while maintaining control. Then the master caution light illuminated, and a warning tone filled the cockpit. Engine fire warning number 3, Stevens shouted, his voice jumping an octave. Jade's eyes snapped to the engine instruments. Engine 3's temperature was climbing rapidly, and the fire detection system was screaming at them. Of all the things that could go wrong, an engine fire was near the top of the list. Shut it down, Jade said immediately. Captain, Engine 3 fire procedure now. Stevens, notify Denver we have an engine fire and we're shutting down. Number 3. Morrison's hands moved through the shutdown procedure with practiced efficiency. Fuel cut off, fire suppression, electrical isolation. Within seconds, Engine 3 was offline, its fire extinguished by the onboard suppression system. But now they were down to 3 engines, and the asymmetric thrust was going to make the approach even more challenging. This is bad, Morrison said, stating the obvious. Without Engine 3, we've lost a quarter of our thrust, and the asymmetric power is going to make directional control even harder. It's manageable, Jade said, though her mind was racing through the new calculations. We'll need to increase power on Engine 4 to compensate for the loss of 3. The crosswind is actually going to help us. We can use it to offset some of the asymmetric thrust. You're talking about using a crosswind as an advantage? Stevens asked. Incredulous. I'm talking about using everything we have, Jade corrected. In a normal landing, crosswinds are a problem. In this landing, they're a tool. We just have to be smart about how we use them. Altitude 8,000 feet, Stevens reported. Denver is 10 miles. They're asking if we need to divert to a longer runway? Negative, Jade said firmly. We're committed. Any change now increases risk. We stay with 16R. Morrison looked at her, and Jade saw the question in his eyes. Are you sure? Can you really do this? She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of her flight instructor when she'd requested her first solo in the F-16, in the eyes of her squadron commander when she'd volunteered for the most dangerous missions, in the eyes of every person who'd ever doubted whether she belonged in the cockpit. Captain, Jade said, her voice steady and clear, I know you're scared. I know this is outside your experience. I know that trusting me goes against every instinct you have, because I don't look like what you think a fighter pilot should look like. But I need you to understand something. I have done this before. Not in a 737, but in an F-16 with one engine on fire and hydraulics failing over hostile territory. I brought that plane home, and I'm going to bring this one home too. Morrison held her gaze for a long moment, and Jade saw something shift in his expression. Not just acceptance, but genuine respect. All right, Major, he said. You have the aircraft. Tell me what you need. It was a small thing, that transfer of authority, but it meant everything. For the first time since she'd entered the cockpit, Jade wasn't just advising, she was in command. Stevens, I need continuous call-outs on altitude, speed, and distance to runway, Jade said, her voice taking on the crisp authority of a combat pilot. Captain, your only job now is to follow my throttle commands exactly. No interpretation, no hesitation. When I say add power, you add power. When I say reduce, you reduce. Clear? Clear, Morrison said. Altitude 6,000 feet, speed 280 knots, 6 miles to runway, Stevens called out. Jade's eyes moved between the instruments and the view through the windscreen. Denver International was spread out before them, the long runway clearly visible. Emergency vehicles were already in position, their lights flashing in the afternoon sun. "Reduce. Id power on engines 1 and 2, increase on 4, Jade commanded. "We're going to start our turn to final approach. This is going to be gradual, no sudden movements." Morrison's hands moved on the throttles, and the plane began a slow, agonizing turn toward the runway. Without hydraulics, every adjustment took longer. Every correction required patience and precision. "Altitude 4,000 feet, speed 260 knots, 4 miles, Stevens reported. They were lined up now, the runway stretching out before them like a narrow ribbon of concrete. At 200 knots, they'd cover that distance in less than 2 minutes. 2 minutes to get everything right, or 180 people would pay the price for any mistake. "Captain, start reducing power across all engines," Jade said. "We need to slow to 220 knots for final approach. Gradual reduction, maintain the asymmetric thrust ratio." The plane slowed, and Jade felt aid. The crosswind pushing them. She called out corrections, and Morrison responded instantly, his earlier hesitation replaced by focused execution. "Altitude 2,000 feet, speed 230 knots, 2 miles, Stevens called. "Landing gear," Jade said. Morrison reached for the gear lever, then hesitated. "Without hydraulics. The gear has a gravity extension backup," Jade said. "It'll drop and lock mechanically. Do it now." Morrison pulled the lever, and they felt the thunk of the landing gear extending and locking into place. 3 green lights confirmed all gear was down. "Altitude 1,000 feet, speed 210. Knots, 1 mile, Stevens reported, his voice tight with tension. Through the windscreen, the runway was rushing toward them. Too fast, too steep, too many things that could still go wrong. But Jade's hands were steady, her voice calm, her mind clear. This was what she'd trained for. This was what she was born to do. "Final approach," Jade announced. "Captain, maintain current power settings until I call for reduction. Stevens, brace position. Everyone in the cabin should be braced." Stevens keyed the intercom. "Flight attendants, prepare for landing. Brace position." In the cabin behind them, Christine would be making sure everyone was secured, that loose items were stowed, that people were prepared for an impact that would be far harder than any normal landing. And somewhere in seat 23F, Jade's carry-on bag was still stowed in the overhead bin, containing her resume for the job. Interview she was supposed to attend tomorrow, an interview that suddenly seemed trivial compared to the task at hand. "Altitude 500 feet, speed 205 knots, Stevens called. The runway filled their vision now, emergency vehicles tracking their approach, foam already being sprayed on the concrete too. "Reduce friction and fire risk. This is it," Jade said quietly. "Captain, on my mark, reduce power to idle on all engines. We're going to drop like a rock, but the gear will take it. Trust the aircraft." "Altitude 200 feet, Stevens called, his voice barely above a whisper. Jade watched the runway. Rush up to meet them, calculating the exact moment, the precise instant when they needed to cut power and let gravity do its work. 100 feet. Almost there. Almost home. 50 feet. Now. "Cut power," Jade commanded. And as Morrison pulled all 3 throttles to idle, Flight 447 dropped toward the runway with 180 souls on board, guided by a black woman in a college sweatshirt who'd spent her entire career proving she belonged in moments exactly like this one. The main landing gear hit the runway with a force that rattled every rivet in the aircraft. At 205 knots, nearly 240 miles per hour, the impact was brutal, violent, and exactly what Jade had expected. "Nose down, gently," she commanded as the plane bounced slightly, the nose gear still airborne. Morrison pushed forward on the yoke, useless for steering, but the weight of his arms helped bring the nose down, the front gear. Slammed onto the concrete with another jarring impact, and suddenly all 3 sets of wheels were on the ground. But they were still traveling at highway speeds on a runway that was rapidly running out. Reverse thrust on engines 1, 2, and 4, Jade shouted. Maximum reverse! Morrison's hands flew to the thrust reverses, and Jade felt the powerful deceleration as the engines redirected their thrust forward, fighting against the plane's momentum. But without hydraulics, they had no wheel brakes, no spoilers to kill lift, nothing but engine reverse thrust and friction to slow 150,000 pounds of aircraft. The runway markers flashed past at terrifying speed. Jade's eyes tracked their position, calculating distance remaining versus deceleration rate. It was going to be close, dangerously close. Crosswind is pushing us right, Stevens called out, his voice tight with fear. Jade saw it too. The plane was drifting toward the right edge of the runway, the crosswind taking advantage of their lack of steering control. At this speed, leaving the runway meant a catastrophic crash. Reduce reverse thrust on engine 4, increase on 1, Jade commanded. Use the asymmetric reverse to counter the drift. It was a technique she'd developed in her own mind during those long nights in Afghanistan, lying in her bunk and mentally rehearsing every possible emergency scenario. Asymmetric reverse thrust, using the engines not just to slow down, but to steer. She'd never actually done it, actually, in real life, had never had the opportunity to test whether it would work. Until now. Morrison made the adjustment, and miraculously, the plane began to track back toward the center line. The differential reverse thrust was acting like a rudder, giving them just enough directional control to keep them on the pavement. Speed 150 knots, Stevens reported. We're halfway down the runway. Halfway down and still going too fast. Jade's mind raced through the physics. At their current deceleration rate, they'd need another 7,000 feet to stop. The runway was 16,000 feet total. They'd used 8,000. That left 8,000 remaining. They were going to make it. Barely. Maintain maximum reverse thrust, Jade said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. We're going to use every inch of this runway, but we're going to stop. The emergency vehicles were pacing them now. Fire. Trucks and ambulances tracking their progress down the runway, ready to respond if the plane left the pavement or caught fire. Speed 100 knots, Stevens called. 3,000 feet remaining. The plane was slowing, but not fast enough. Jade could see the end of the runway approaching, the overrun area beyond it and past that, the grass and dirt that would tear the landing gear off if they reached it. Come on, Morrison muttered under his breath, his hands white-knuckled on the thrust levers. Come on, slow down. Speed 70 knots, 1,000 feet remaining. They were in the overrun area, now past the normal runway, but still on concrete. The plane was shaking, the tires screaming, the engines roaring in reverse. Every system was being pushed beyond its design limits. Speed 40 knots, 500 feet. We're going to make it, Jade said. And for the first time since entering the cockpit, she allowed herself to believe it. Speed 20 knots. The plane rolled to a stop with less than 200 feet of overrun remaining. For a moment, nobody moved. The cockpit was silent, except for the sound of 3 people breathing hard, their hearts pounding, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. They'd done it. Against every odd, against physics and probability, and the doubt of everyone who'd questioned whether Jade belonged in that cockpit, they'd done it. Flight 447, Denver Tower. Confirm you are stopped and secure? Stevens grabbed the radio with shaking hands. Denver Tower, Flight 447 is stopped. We are down safe. His voice broke on the last word, and Jade saw tears streaming down his face. Morrison's head was bowed, his shoulders shaking with either laughter or sobs, maybe both. Emergency crews are approaching your aircraft, the tower controller said, and Jade could hear the emotion in his voice too. Outstanding job, 447, outstanding. Through the cockpit windows, Jade could see the emergency vehicles surrounding them, firefighters in silver suits approaching cautiously, checking for fuel leaks or fire hazards. But the plane was intact. The passengers were safe and they were on the ground. Morrison turned to look at Jade, and she saw something in his eyes she'd rarely seen in her career. Pure, unqualified respect. "Major Williams," he said, his voice hoarse, "you just saved 180 lives, including mine." "We saved them," Jade corrected. "You trusted me when every instinct told you not to. That took courage." "No," Morrison shook his head. "You had the knowledge, the skill, the experience. I just followed your instructions. This was all you." Stevens unbuckled his harness and turned around fully. "Major, I've been flying for 5 years, and I've never seen anything like that. The way you use the engines to steer, the asymmetric reverse thrust, that's not in any manual I've ever read." "That's because I wrote it in my head," Jade said with a slight smile. "Sometimes the best techniques are the ones you develop yourself when the manual doesn't have an answer for the situation you're in." The cockpit door burst open, and Christine rushed in, tears streaming down her face. "We're down. We're actually down. The passengers are—" She stopped, looking at Jade. "Major Williams, they want to see you. They want to—" "Thank you." Jade felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the bone-deep tiredness that came after every high-stress mission. But she nodded and unbuckled her harness. As she stood, Morrison stood too and extended his hand. "Major, I owe you an apology. When you first came into this cockpit, I doubted you. I saw your age, your appearance, and I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. That was wrong, and it could have cost lives." Jade shook his hand. "Captain, you're not the first person to doubt me, and you won't be the last. What matters is that when it counted, you listened, you trusted, and that's what saved everyone on this plane." She moved toward the cockpit door, but Stevens called out, "Major, what you did today, this is going to be studied in flight schools for years. You know that, right? This landing, this technique, it's going to change how we train pilots for emergencies." Jade paused at the door. "Then make sure they teach it right. Make sure they teach that skill and knowledge matter more than what someone looks like. Make sure they teach that the person you underestimate might be the person who saves your life." She stepped into the cabin, and the scene that greeted her was surreal. Passengers were crying, hugging each other, some still gripping their armrests with white knuckles. As Jade appeared, a silence fell over the cabin, and then someone started clapping. It started with one person, then spread like wildfire through the aircraft. Within seconds, all 180 passengers were on their feet, applauding, some cheering, some crying, all of them alive because of the woman in the college sweatshirt who'd been sleeping in seat 23F. Jade felt her throat tighten with emotion. In 10 years of military service, she'd received medals, commendations, and official recognition. But she'd never received this spontaneous, genuine gratitude from people whose lives she'd saved. The man from first class, the one who'd demanded to speak to the captain, who'd questioned her qualifications, pushed his way forward. His face was red, his eyes wet with tears. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I said terrible things. I doubted you, and you saved my life anyway." Jade looked at him for a long moment. She could have been angry, could have thrown his doubt back in his face, but she was too tired for anger, and he looked genuinely remorseful. "Sir," she said quietly, "I didn't save your life to prove a point. I saved it because that's what I'm trained to do. But maybe next time you'll think twice before assuming someone isn't qualified based on how they look." He nodded, unable to speak, and stepped back. An elderly woman approached, taking Jade's hands in hers. "My granddaughter wants to be a pilot," she said. "She's 12 years old and she's black, and she's been told by teachers and counselors that maybe she should consider other careers. I'm going to tell her about you. I'm to tell her that she can do anything, be anything, because I saw it with my own eyes today." Jade felt tears prick her own eyes. "Tell her," she said, "that the sky doesn't care what color you are. It only cares if you're good enough to master it. And if she works hard enough, she will be." As Jade made her way through the cabin, accepting thanks and hugs and tearful gratitude, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. Every obstacle, every doubt, every person who'd told her she didn't belong. They'd all been preparing her for this moment, and if you've ever been told you don't, belongs somewhere. If you've ever had your qualifications questioned because of how you look, then you understand why this moment mattered so much. Not just because lives were saved, but because assumptions were shattered. And maybe, just maybe, the next black woman who walks into a cockpit will face a little less doubt because of what happened on Flight 447 today. Christine appeared at Jade's side as she reached her original seat, 23F, where her carry-on was still stowed overhead, where she'd been sleeping peacefully just an hour ago. "Major Williams," Christine said softly, "I need to apologize. Too, when you first told me you were a fighter pilot, I hesitated, I doubted, and that could have cost everyone on this plane their lives." "You brought me to the cockpit," Jade said. "That's what mattered. But I almost didn't," Christine admitted. "And I need to be better than that. We all do." Through the cabin windows, Jade could see the emergency crews completing their inspection of the aircraft. Soon, they'd deploy the evacuation slides and get everyone off the plane. There would be debriefings, investigations, media coverage, and probably a lot of attention that Jade didn't particularly want. But right now, in this moment, she was just grateful to be alive, grateful that everyone was safe, and grateful that she'd been in the right place at the right time with the right skills, even if nobody had expected her to be the one who had them. Morrison's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison. I want to personally thank Major Jade Williams, United States Air Force, retired, for her extraordinary skill and courage today. Without her expertise, I honestly don't know if we would have made it. She is a true hero, and we all owe her our lives." The cabin erupted in applause again, and Jade felt her face flush with embarrassment. She'd never been comfortable with praise, had always preferred to let her work speak for itself. But maybe, just this once, it was okay to accept the recognition, to let people see that heroes don't always look like what you expect. That skill and courage come in all colors, all genders, all backgrounds, and that the person you overlook might be the person who saves your life. As the evacuation began and passengers started filing toward the emergency exits, Jade gathered her carry-on and prepared to leave the aircraft. Tomorrow, she'd been scheduled for a job interview with a corporate aviation company. A safe, comfortable position, flying executives around in private jets. But after today, she wasn't sure that was what she wanted anymore, because today had reminded her why she'd become a pilot in the first place. Not for the money or the prestige, but for moments like this, when skill and training and sheer determination could mean the difference between life and death. The question was, what came next? The Denver airport terminal had been transformed into a media circus. Within an hour of Flight 447's emergency landing, news crews from every major network crowded the arrival gates, cameras ready, reporters practicing their opening lines about the miracle landing and the hero pilot. Jade sat in a quiet office provided by airport security, trying to process everything that had happened. Her phone had been buzzing non-stop since they'd evacuated the plane. Texts, calls, notifications from social media accounts she barely used. The story was already going viral. Black woman fighter pilot saves 180 lives after being doubted. There was a knock on the door, and a woman in an FAA jacket entered, followed by 2 NTSB investigators. "Major Williams, I'm Sarah Chen, lead investigator for the NTSB. We need to conduct a preliminary interview about the incident." For the next hour, Jade walked them through every decision, every calculation, every moment of the emergency. The investigators listened with expressions that shifted from professional skepticism to genuine awe as she explained the differential thrust techniques, the asymmetric reverse thrust landing, the split-second decisions that had kept the plane on the runway. "Major Williams," Chen said finally, "in 20 years of investigating aviation incidents, I've never seen anything like this. The technique you used, it's not in any training manual, any emergency procedure guide. Where did you learn it?" "I didn't learn it," Jade said. I developed it in Afghanistan after I had to land. Had an F-16 with failed hydraulics. I spent months afterward thinking about what I'd done instinctively, breaking it down into a repeatable procedure. I wrote it up, submitted it to my squadron commander as a potential addition to emergency training protocols. And, Chen asked. Jade's smile was bitter. And it was rejected. The review board said it was too unconventional and not supported by sufficient data. What they meant was that it came from a junior officer who didn't fit their profile of what a tactical innovator should look like. Chen's expression hardened. Do you still have that report? Every word of it. It's been sitting in a folder on my laptop for 3 years, along with about a dozen other procedure improvements that were dismissed or ignored. I'd like to see them, Chen said. All of them. Because what you did today is going to change how we train pilots for catastrophic emergencies, and I want to make sure you get the credit you deserve. Before Jade could respond, the door burst open and a man in an Air Force uniform strode in. A colonel, his chest decorated with ribbons that marked him as someone important. Major Williams, he said, and Jade's stomach dropped as she recognized him. Colonel Marcus Hendricks, her former wing commander, the man who'd signed off on her early retirement request without asking why she was leaving. "Colonel," Jade said, standing automatically despite no longer being subject to military protocol. "At ease, Major. Or should I say civilian?" Hendricks's tone was unreadable. "I've been watching the news coverage. Quite a feat you pulled off today." "Just doing what I was trained to do, sir." "That's not entirely accurate, is it?" Hendricks said, and Jade felt her defenses rise. "What you did today went far. Beyond your training. It was innovative, brilliant, and exactly the kind of tactical thinking we tried to cultivate in you at the Academy and in your squadron. With respect, sir, that's not how I remember it." Hendricks had the grace to look uncomfortable. "No, I suppose it isn't. Major. Williams, Jade, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. When you submitted your emergency procedure proposals, I was one of the officers who voted to table them. When you reported the harassment you faced from some of your squadron mates, I told you to develop thicker skin. And when requested early retirement, I signed the papers without asking why one of my best pilots was walking away." Jade felt years of suppressed anger rising in her chest. "You want to know why I left, Colonel? Because I was tired. Tired of being twice as good to get half the recognition. Tired of having my innovations dismissed while male officers with half my flight hours got promoted over me. Tired of being called diversity hire behind my back and having to smile through it. I loved flying, but I couldn't love a system that refused to see me as anything more than a checkbox on a diversity. Report!" The room was silent. Chen and the other investigators were staring at their notepads, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Hendricks took a breath. "You're right. About all of it. And I'm not here to make excuses or ask for forgiveness. I'm here to tell you that the Air Force is watching what happened today, and there are people at the Pentagon who want to talk to you about coming back. Not as a line pilot, but as an instructor, a tactical development officer, someone who can teach the next generation of pilots the skills you demonstrated today. With respect, sir, I'm not interested in going back to an organization that didn't value me when I was there. I understand, but Jade, what you did today, it's bigger than your personal grievances with the Air Force. You developed a technique that could save lives in future emergencies. You proved that unconventional thinking and innovation can come from anywhere, from anyone. The Air Force needs that. The entire aviation industry needs that." Before Jade could respond, there was another knock on the door. This time, it was Christine, the flight attendant, looking flustered. "Major Williams, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone outside who's insisting on seeing you. She says she's your mother." Jade's heart jumped. "My mother is here. She saw the news coverage and drove straight from Colorado Springs. She's in the terminal with about 50 reporters trying to interview her. Jade pushed past Hendricks and the investigators, making her way through the terminal corridors to the arrival area. And there, surrounded by cameras and microphones, was her mother, Dr. Patricia Williams, still in her hospital scrubs from her shift at the VA Medical Center. "Mom!" Jade called out, and Patricia's head snapped. Around. Jade! Her mother pushed through the crowd of reporters, and suddenly Jade was wrapped in her arms, breathing in the familiar scent of hospital antiseptic and her mother's perfume. "Baby girl," Patricia whispered, pulling back to look at her daughter's face. "I was watching the news at work, and when I saw it was your flight, when I heard what you did," her voice broke. "I'm so proud of you. Your father would be so proud." Jade felt tears streaming down her face. Her father, a Marine Corps mechanic, had died when she was 15. He'd been the one who'd first taken her to an air show, who'd encouraged her dream of becoming a pilot, who'd told her that she could do anything she set her mind to. "I wish he could have seen it," Jade said. "He did, baby. I know he did." Patricia turned to face the cameras, her arms still around her daughter. "My daughter has been proving people wrong her entire life. When she said she wanted to fly fighter jets, people told her to be realistic. When she got into the Air Force Academy, people said she was a diversity admission. When she graduated near the top of her class, people said she'd gotten special treatment. And when she saved 180 lives today, I guarantee there are still people who will find a way to diminish what she accomplished." Patricia's voice grew stronger, more forceful. "But I want everyone watching to understand something. Jade Williams earned every achievement, every rank, every flight hour through skill, determination and excellence. She didn't get opportunities because of her race or gender. She got them despite the obstacles those things created. And if the system had valued her properly, if the Air Force had listened to her innovations instead of dismissing them, maybe we'd have better emergency procedures already in place. Maybe other pilots would already know the techniques she had to develop on her own." The reporters were silent, cameras rolling, capturing every word. "My daughter left the Air Force because she was tired of fighting battles on the ground that were harder than the ones in the air," Patricia continued, "and that's a tragedy because the military and this country needs people like Jade, people who can think outside the box, who can stay calm under pressure, who can save lives when everything is falling apart. We need them, but we keep pushing them away because they don't look like what we expect heroes to look like." A reporter called out, "Dr. Williams, what do you want people to take away from your daughter's story?" Patricia looked at Jade, then back at the cameras. "I want people to understand that the person you underestimate, the person you overlook, the person you dismiss because of their race or gender or age, that person might be the one who saves your life someday. And maybe, just maybe, we should start treating everyone with the respect and recognition they deserve before we need them to be heroes." The terminal erupted in applause, not just from reporters, but from travelers who'd stopped to watch, from airport employees, from some of the passengers from Flight 447 who were still in the terminal. Jade felt overwhelmed by the moment, by the recognition, by the vindication of everything she'd endured. But more than that, she felt her mother's arm around her shoulders, solid and supportive, the way it had been through every challenge of her life. Colonel Hendricks approached, his expression respectful. "Dr. Williams, your daughter is an exceptional officer and an even more exceptional person. The Air Force failed her, and I take personal responsibility for my part in that failure." Patricia looked him up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who'd spent 30 years as a trauma surgeon, seeing through people's facades to what lay beneath. "Colonel, my daughter doesn't need your apologies. She needs systemic change. She needs an organization that values innovation over conformity, that promotes based on merit rather than familiarity, that sees talent regardless of what package it comes in." "I agree completely," Hendricks said, "and I'm hoping Jade will consider helping us create that change." Before anyone could respond, another commotion erupted near the terminal entrance. A group of people in flight suits were pushing through the crowd. Pilots, Jade realized, both military and commercial, wearing their uniforms and wings. One of them, a woman with captain's bars, stepped forward. "Major Williams, we're pilots from across the country who flew in as soon as we heard what happened. We wanted to meet you, to thank you, and to tell you that what you did today matters, not just because you saved lives, but because you proved something that a lot of us have been trying to prove our entire careers." "What's that?" Jade asked. "That excellence has no gender, no color, no predetermined profile, that the best pilot in the room might not be who you expect, and that innovation and courage can come from anywhere." The captain extended her hand. "Thank you for showing the world what we've always known." As Jade shook hands with pilot after pilot, each sharing their own stories of being underestimated or overlooked, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about one emergency landing. This was about changing the narrative, about opening doors, about making it easier for the next person who didn't fit the traditional mold. A young black girl, maybe 10 years old, pushed through the crowd with her father. "Excuse me," she said shyly. "Are you the pilot who saved the plane?" Jade knelt down to the girl's level. "I am. What's your name?" "Amara. I want to be a pilot when I grow up, but my teacher said girls like me don't usually become pilots." Jade felt a familiar anger flare, but she kept her voice gentle. "Amara, your teacher is wrong. Girls like you, girls like us, can become anything we want to be. It might be harder, and you might have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition, but you can do it. And every time someone tells you that you can't, remember today. Remember that a girl who looks like you saved 180 lives because she refused to believe the people who said she didn't belong." Amara's eyes were wide with wonder. "Can I take a picture with you?" "Of course." As Amara's father snapped photos, Jade saw the hope and determination in the young girl's face, and she understood why this moment mattered so much. It wasn't about her ego or her vindication. It was about every Amara out there who needed to see that someone who looked like her could be a hero. The question was, what would Jade do with this platform, this moment of recognition, this opportunity to create the change she'd always wanted to see? 6 months after Flight 447, Jade stood in front of a lecture hall at the Air Force Academy, looking out at 200 cadets who were hanging on her. Every word. The room was more diverse than it had been when she'd been a student here 15 years ago. More women, more people of color, more faces that didn't fit the traditional fighter pilot mold. "Emergency procedures," she said, advancing her presentation to show the hydraulic failure. "Scenario are only as good as the pilot's ability to think beyond them. The manual will get you through 90% of situations, but that last 10%, the catastrophic failures, the scenarios nobody planned for, that's where innovation and adaptability separate the pilots who survive from the ones who don't." She clicked to the next slide, showing the cockpit footage from Flight 447 that had been released by the NTSB. The cadets leaned forward, watching as she guided Captain Morrison through the differential thrust landing. "What you're seeing here is a technique that didn't exist in any manual 6 months ago. Now it's being taught at every major flight school in the country, military and civilian. Not because I'm special, but because I was willing to think differently when the situation demanded it." After the lecture, cadets lined up to ask questions, to get advice, to tell her their own stories of being underestimated. Jade stayed until she'd spoken with every single one, remembering how much it would have meant to her to have someone like herself to look up to when she'd been in their position. As the last cadet left, Colonel Hendricks entered the lecture hall. In the 6 months since Denver, he'd become an unexpected ally, using his position to push for systemic changes in how the Air Force evaluated innovations and promoted officers. "Another excellent lecture, Jade," he said. "The cadets love you. Hell, everyone loves you. You're the most popular instructor we've had in years. I'm not here to be popular, Jade said, gathering her materials. I'm here to make sure the next generation doesn't face the same obstacles I did. And you're succeeding. Applications to the Academy from minority candidates are up 40% this year. They're calling it the Williams effect. Jade smiled slightly. The job offer from the Air Force had come with conditions: full authority to revise emergency training protocols, a position on the Promotion Review Board to ensure merit-based advancement, and the freedom to speak publicly about the systemic issues that had driven her out in the first place. She'd negotiated hard, and she'd won, because this time they needed her more than she needed them. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Turn on CNN. You're going to want to see this." Jade pulled up the news stream on her tablet, and her breath caught. The headline read, "FAA announces major overhaul of emergency training standards, credits Major Jade Williams." The FAA administrator was at a podium, explaining how Jade's techniques were being incorporated into mandatory training for all commercial pilots. Behind him was a slide showing her emergency procedure manual, the one that had been rejected by her squadron 3 years ago, now being adopted as the gold standard for hydraulic failure scenarios. Major Williams's innovations, the administrator said, represent the kind of forward-thinking approach to aviation safety that we should have embraced years ago. Her techniques have already been credited with helping pilots successfully manage 2 additional hydraulic emergencies in the past 6 months, saving over 300 lives total. Hendricks watched over her shoulder. "You changed the industry, Jade, not just by saving Flight 447, but by forcing everyone to recognize that innovation can come from anywhere, from anyone." "It shouldn't have taken a viral emergency landing to make that happen," Jade said. "No, it shouldn't have, but sometimes change requires a catalyst. You were that catalyst." That evening, Jade attended a gala in Washington, D.C., where she was receiving the FAA's highest civilian honor for her contributions to aviation safety. The ballroom was filled with pilots, aviation executives, military brass and politicians, the same kind of people who'd spent years overlooking her. As she accepted the award, Jade looked out at the audience and saw faces she recognized: Captain Morrison and co-pilot Stevens, both of whom had become vocal advocates for diversity in aviation; Christine, the flight attendant, who'd started a mentorship program for young women interested in aviation careers; the elderly woman from Flight 447, sitting with her granddaughter, who was now enrolled in a youth aviation program, and in the back of the room, trying to be inconspicuous, was the man from first class, the one who'd questioned her qualifications, who'd tried to stop Christine from taking her to the cockpit. He'd reached out to Jade 3 months ago with a long, heartfelt apology and a request to meet. She'd declined the meeting, but had read his letter, in which he described how the experience had forced him to confront his own biases and prejudices. He donated a substantial sum to a scholarship fund for minority aviation students. It didn't erase what he'd said, what he'd believed, but it was a start. 6 months ago, Jade said into the microphone, I was sleeping in seat 23F on a flight to a job interview, trying to figure out what came next after leaving a career I loved because I was tired of fighting to be seen. I never imagined that a hydraulic failure would change not just my life, but the entire conversation about who gets to be a hero, who gets to be an expert, who gets to be trusted with lives. She paused, looking around the room. But here's what I've learned. Change doesn't happen because people suddenly become enlightened. Change happens because someone refuses to accept the status quo. Someone demonstrates undeniably that the old assumptions were wrong, and someone has the courage to keep pushing even when it would be easier to walk away. I didn't save Flight 447 to prove a point. I saved it because that's what I was trained to do, and because 180 lives mattered more than anyone's prejudices or doubts. But the fact that my race and gender became part of the story, That's not my doing, that's society's doing. Because we've created a world where a black woman being competent is somehow newsworthy instead of normal. The room was silent, everyone listening intently. So here's my challenge to everyone in this room. Stop being surprised when people who don't fit your expectations turn out to be excellent. Stop treating diversity as a checkbox exercise and start recognizing it as a source of innovation and strength. Stop making people like me fight twice as hard for half the recognition, because the next time there's an emergency, the person with the skills to save lives might be someone you've been overlooking, and your prejudices might cost lives that could have been saved. The applause was thunderous, and Jade saw several people in the audience wiping their eyes. After the ceremony, a young woman approached, a cadet from the academy, one of the ones who'd stayed after class to talk. "Major Williams, I just wanted to thank you. I was seriously considering dropping out of the flight program because I was tired of being the only black woman in my classes, tired of the comments and the doubts. But watching what you did, hearing you speak, it reminded me why I wanted to fly in the first place." "Don't let them push you out," Jade said firmly. "The aviation industry needs people like you. The military needs people like you. And every time one of us succeeds, we make it a little easier for the next person." As the gala wound down, Jade stepped outside for some air. The Washington Monument was illuminated against the night sky, and she thought about how far she'd come from that scared teenager at the air show, watching fighter jets and dreaming of flying them someday. Her phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something made her answer. "Major Williams? This is Sarah Chen from the NTSB. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to let you know that we've completed our final investigation report on Flight 447. It's going to be published next week, and I thought you should know what it says." "And?" "It concludes that your actions were not just heroic, but represented a level of technical skill and innovative thinking that exceeded anything in our database of emergency landings. The report specifically recommends that your emergency procedures be adopted as mandatory training for all pilots, and that aviation authorities worldwide review their protocols for evaluating and implementing pilot-submitted innovations." Jade felt a lump in her throat. That's incredible." "There's more," Chen continued. "The report also includes a section on systemic barriers to innovation in aviation, specifically addressing how your procedures were initially rejected, despite their merit. It's going to be uncomfortable reading for a lot of people in positions of authority." "Good," Jade said. "Comfort doesn't create change." After hanging up, Jade stood for a moment in the cool night air, processing everything that had happened. 6 months ago, she'd been burned out, disillusioned, ready to walk away from aviation entirely. Now she was changing the industry, inspiring the next generation, and finally receiving the recognition she'd earned years ago. But more importantly, she was opening doors. Every lecture she gave, every interview she did, every time she stood in front of cadets or pilots or young people who didn't see themselves represented in aviation, she was showing them that they belonged, that their dreams were valid, that the sky was big enough for everyone. Her mother's words from that day in Denver echoed in her mind. "The person you underestimate might be the one who saves your life someday." Jade had proven that truth in the most dramatic way possible, but the real victory wasn't just saving Flight 447. The real victory was changing the conversation, challenging the assumptions, and creating a future where the next Jade Williams wouldn't have to fight as hard to be seen. A year after Flight 447, Jade received an invitation to speak at a conference for young women in STEM fields. The keynote address was being given by Amara, the 10-year-old girl from the Denver airport, now 11, and already enrolled in a youth aviation program. Jade sat in the audience as Amara took the stage, confident and articulate, telling her story of how meeting Major Jade Williams had changed her life and her dreams. "My teacher told me that girls like me don't usually become pilots," Amara said to the audience of hundreds of young women. But Major, Williams taught me that usually doesn't matter. What matters is skill, determination, and refusing to let other people's limitations become your own. Watching Amara speak, Jade felt tears streaming down her face. This was why it had all mattered. The struggles, the doubts, the years of fighting to be seen. Because now, young girls like Amara could dream of flying without wondering if they belonged in the cockpit. After Amara's speech, Jade joined her on stage for a Q&A session. A young woman in the audience raised her hand. Major Williams, what would you say to someone who's facing discrimination or being underestimated in their field? Jade thought for a moment. I'd say this: being underestimated is painful, but it can also be powerful. When people don't expect much from you, you have the freedom to exceed their expectations in ways that force them to reconsider everything. They thought they knew. Your success becomes not just personal achievement, but a challenge to the system that tried to limit you. But more importantly, she continued, I'd say that you don't owe anyone your excellence as proof of your worth. You don't have to be twice as good to deserve the same opportunities. You don't have to save a plane full of people to be taken seriously. You deserve respect, recognition, and opportunity simply because you're qualified and capable. The fact that you have to fight harder for those things isn't your failure, it's society's failure. So fight when you have the energy to fight, rest when you need to rest, and remember that every door you open, every barrier you break, every assumption you shatter, you're not just doing it for yourself, you're doing it for everyone who comes after you. The audience erupted in applause, and Jade saw her mother in the front row, tears streaming down her face, pride radiating from every feature. That night, as Jade flew back to Colorado Springs, as a passenger this time, in seat 23F as a private joke to herself, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the academy to Afghanistan, from the squadron that didn't value her to the emergency that proved her worth, from burnout and disillusionment to purpose and impact. The flight attendant stopped at her row. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" Jade looked up and smiled. "No, thank you. I'm good." And for the first time in years, she truly was. The best revenge isn't destroying the people who doubted you. It's succeeding so completely that their doubts become irrelevant. It's changing the system that tried to limit you. It's opening doors for the people who come after you. It's proving that excellence has no predetermined profile and that the person you overlook might be the person who changes everything. Jade Williams didn't just save Flight 447. She saved every future pilot who would benefit from her innovations, every young person who would see themselves in her story, every person who'd been told they didn't belong and needed proof that they did. And if this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated or overlooked or told you weren't good enough, remember this: the sky doesn't care what you look like. It only cares if you're brave enough to reach for it. So reach, climb, fly. And when you get there, send the elevator back down for the next person who needs to see that someone like them made it to the top. Because that's not just success. That's revolution. And it starts with one person refusing to accept that they don't belong and proving beyond any doubt that they always did.